Well, we're at 11:15, so we can resume. Mr. Langley, I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to ask the question that I should have asked you a little earlier now, just to deal with the matter. What I wondered was whether Historic England had any view about the deletion of the 23% coverage in the policies covering the University of York campuses.
The council have been in contact with us and dialogue on those changes to the policies ED 1 to 3, and we don't object to the removal of that figure. I mean, the success of the campus west was very much a result of a sort of ambitious and visionary approach to the landscaping of the campus, rather than applying a kind of a policy restriction in terms of a percentage. And the quality of the initial design and commitment to it, it's the quality of the initial design and the commitment to it that has sort of seen its success, rather than a focus on as I say, on a kind of an arbitrary figure, if you like. And clearly, in terms of Campus East and its future development or redevelopment, whatever that may be, there are clearly a number of designated heritage assets now within that area since 2018, including the Registered Park and Garden and a number of listed buildings, which themselves will obviously place constraints on what can and can't be done within that area. So, no, we don't have any particular concerns. And in terms of the Campus East site, again, there are appropriate criteria within the policy, we feel, that will ensure that future development will kind of follow that landscaped campus approach, but doesn't necessarily have to be that prescriptive over the development footprint of that development. We did sign a statement of common ground, which I believe is now on the website from last Friday. So that covers kind of all of those points, if you like. As I say, the only kind of area of outstanding disagreement between ourselves and the council is around the Greenbelt matters around ST27.
That's very helpful, Mr. Langley. Thank you.
Because of the heritage implications, we made sure that Historic England were kept in the loop with regard to the 23%. Yeah.
I'm trying to remember where we are, or where we were. We'd heard a few representations. Mr. Tucker, shall I come to you first, and then I'll come to Mr. Elvin, or would you prefer to do it? Go ahead, Mr. Tucker, then.
Well, I was just wondering, actually, Mr. We've heard a number of points. Are you happy for us to continue on, or would you like us to come back to you at this point?
I'm happy to do whatever order you like.
Mr. Tucker, then.
Yes, sir. I'm very conscious that Ms. Markham has had her role built up as a preliminary, so I was going to turn to her for a moment. Before I do, can I just pick up a couple of points, and then there is one point that I'm just going to ask for some clarification with regard to the notion of the utilisation of the science park, a very specific point about the tenants, if I may. So the first point, just to pick up from what Mr. Langler had said, it is an obvious point, but it's an obvious point worth making. At the time of the 2007 decision, the assumption that was properly made by all parties, because it was the assumption that one always made, or still makes in relation to York, is that where there is no fixed inner boundary of the Greenbelt, work on the assumption that the land is in the Greenbelt. So that decision was based on the assumption that all the land fell within the Greenbelt, and very special circumstances had to be demonstrated. Now, why does that matter? Well, it matters because it was therefore a prerequisite and a priori assumption that the land could fulfil a Greenbelt function, and that was the base upon which the Secretary of State made the decision. What we're doing here, as I don't think it was me that was clever enough to describe it as Schrodinger's Greenbelt, but where that was certainly a phrase used on the last occasion, i.e. when we are fixing the inner boundary of the Greenbelt, so it's a slightly different exercise. And so whilst Mr Langler's right that the issue in terms of the fourth purpose of Greenbelt is a relevant consideration. What's also relevant are the factors within 143. In other words, is it necessary to keep land open, permanently open, 143B? That's the assessment that one needs to be asking in relation to ST27, and whether or not that fulfills the function that's been identified, mindful of the view of both ourselves and the city that there is a need to ensure that views from the A64 are protected. So it's a nuanced point, but it's a rather different approach to come at it, rather than saying it is Greenbelt. Should it be released, given its function to preserve the setting of the historic city itself? Having said that, if I can just then ask about the science park, ask Harvey Dowdy to just deal with that, if you would. Just a specific point raised by Mrs Hinton.
Yes, thank you very much. Just to provide some reassurance, I hope, that post-COVID we've undertaken a review of all the tenants on the science park, and we've done that in estates in conjunction with the Department for Research, Innovation and Knowledge Exchange. So we acknowledge that there are different degrees of collaboration, but we are satisfied that either the companies there are direct collaborators, or they provide support for teaching and internships, or they are in fact spin-outs from university internal businesses. We're able to review these annually because the tenants are on licenses or very short contracted out licenses. And in fact, to make space, on the rationalisation point, some of our tenants that are registered are now virtual and not occupying physical space. So I just hope that helps as a point of clarification.
Then on the more substantive point, if I can ask Lucy Mark just to come in. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm a partner in the planning department at Montague Evans, and I specialise in historic environments. So I'm dual qualified with the RTPI and IHBC. I think you'll have seen the representations prepared by Chris Mealy, who's also a partner at Montague Evans in 2018, which were prepared in response to the objection from Historic England, which I think they've maintained with a sort of similar content in their recent reps. And I've overseen the recent representations dated August of this year in response to the Cushman and Wakefield report, in response to the question whether or not the university should intensify the existing campus. And it's just worth noting that since the 2018 representations, a lot of the West Campus was designated as an RPG, a registered park and garden, and a number of the original university buildings were Grade 2 listed. So the recent reps update the sort of 2018 reps to reflect that. So I'm going to deal with those sort of two main points. First, to respond to Historic England's objection, and then second, to deal with the development potential of Campus West. Going to the first point, Historic England's objection really is a general point that any loss of the green belt within the ring road would adversely affect the city, and there's nothing specific to ST27. The other point I wanted to make was that the objection conflates the historic city with the city as a whole. The historic city is quite precisely defined by the conservation area designation, and the subsequent development outside that historic city is generally 20th century suburban expansion, largely of ordinary character and quality. There would be potential for landscape screening, and that would be proposed as part of an application going forward, which would minimise the effect from the A64. And I think a very important point is that ST27 does not feature in the experience of heritage assets that define York or make it special. There's no allegation of any setting impact on any of the heritage assets, including those at Heslington. And there's no functional historic connection with any of the designated heritage assets or in the historic core between the site at S27. Heslington Hall, which is Grade 2 star listed, is 1.2 kilometres from the proposed allocation site. and there'd be no effect on the new designations at the West Campus because of the separating distances and the extent of interposing vegetation and interposing development. Another key point is that there are no views of the Minster or any part of the historic core from the land or from this part of the A64. And it's worth noting that the York Conservation Area Appraisal, which identifies a number of views from the ring road and from the outer parts of the city, doesn't identify any views from the site or from the ring road in this location. We also maintain that the land has no intrinsic value and contributes nothing to the historic landscape structure. It's been isolated by the university and the ring road. It's a typical rectangular field, typical of enclosure cultivation, and it's not part of the Ings or Strays or any other special historic landscape feature. There are 11 Roman roads that converge on York. Hull Road to the north is one of these, and it's roughly on the alignment of the Roman road, but ST27 does not abut it, and there's no setting relationship with that Roman road. There are also no direct historic associations. For example, the site's not near any battles or known battle sites. In terms of dealing with the point about the relationship with the historic villages, we note that Historic England does not identify the villages that were of concern, and Heslington is essentially already part of the city as a result of the development of the university. And ST27 is located to the south of the East Campus and not to the south of the Heslington Conservation Area, so it would retain its relationship with its agricultural hinterland. S27 is located well within the ring road and is closely associated with the existing campus, whereas the surrounding villages are beyond the ring road, and the land is not necessary to maintain a distinct and sort of separation from those other historic villages. So that deals with the Historic England objections to the allocation site. I'd now like to turn to whether Campus West has any development potential and the extent of the development potential of that.
If I could just pick up on one point. Sure. You say that it doesn't make any contribution to the landscape structure in the ways that, for example, Ings or Strays do. As you'll know, one of the things that the council has analysed through its evidence is the notion of a compact city in relation to Purpose 4. Is there anything that you wanted to say on that?
I mean, I think we sort of deal with that in the 2018 reps. I mean, I think the development would remain within the ring road, and when you were travelling along the ring road in a car, you'd be able to see landscape screening, and I don't think it would have an effect on the compactness of the city. So I'll carry on with the assessment of the West Campus. As I mentioned earlier, Campus West is now covered by multiple heritage designations. There's a heritage asset plan that's reproduced at Appendix 1 of our 2022 reps. And the significance of those heritage assets is considered in Section 3 of that document. The Campus West is of historic interest because it's part of a wave of 7 new university buildings built in new universities established in the post-war period to increase access to higher education. The Registered Park and Garden is a well-preserved mid-20th century landscape-led master plan which overlaid an earlier formal 17th century and 18th century designed landscape. And the landscape is characterised by low-scale college ranges which are carefully placed in the landscape to create a sense of openness, by lakeside walks, and the car-free environment creates a cloistered atmosphere. The Derwent, former Langwith College's Central Hall and the covered walkway are all Grade 2 listed. And Heslington Hall is Grade 2 star listed. That's an earlier building dating from the mid-16th century, but with later alterations. And part of the Heslington Conservation Area covers the western part of the eastern part of the campus. There's statutory protection for the listed buildings in the conservation area, and the MPPF identifies that great weight attaches to the conservation of designated heritage assets. The designations don't preclude development within the RPG, but any harm to it would be of great weight. We've considered the committed and future capital projects that the university has for the West Campus, and the fact that there are 2 further opportunity sites. There's a peninsula redevelopment. In terms of that, that's a prominent location within the registered park and garden. The existing buildings are unlisted, but they make a positive contribution to the original design concept. And redevelopment of that area at a greater scale has potential to cause harm to the registered park and garden and to the setting of listed buildings. The South Car Park is the other potential opportunity site. That's located at the boundary of the Heslington Conservation Area. It's also in the setting of some of the listed buildings, and there's potential for setting effect on buildings within the conservation area along Main Street and the Heslington Lane. So there's potential there to harm the conservation area, setting of listed buildings and the registered park and garden. I leave it to others to comment on the extent which the limited potential for redevelopment in the West Campus would deliver the university's needs. Turning now to the response to the Cushman and Wakefield report, I note that that's not been informed by expert heritage advice. There was some recognition that there was increasingly limited capacity at the West Campus with the East Campus appeal decision. If any of the listed buildings were extended either by sort of extensions to the rear or the side or roof extensions, that's likely to result in less than substantial harm to the listed buildings. The class structure of the listed buildings and the unlisted class buildings is lightweight, and it's doubtful whether it would be structurally feasible to extend them upwards, and that applies both to the listed and the unlisted class buildings. The redevelopment or extension of later buildings, which are already of larger scale, has potential to harm the registered park and garden and also the setting of listed buildings. And I note that Mr. Langler from Historic England agrees that the heritage designations place constraints on the development potential. So, in conclusion, if you compare the intensification of the West Campus with the proposed allocation site of S27 in heritage terms, the proposed allocation site is preferable. In my professional opinion, it would give rise to no harmful effects on designated heritage assets, whereas the West Campus is heavily constrained and has potential to harm the registered park and garden, the listed buildings and the conservation area, which limit the development potential.
Thank you, that's helpful.
So can I just add a couple of points, if I may? Firstly, just in relation to Sir Mr. Berkeley's question about the compact city, just to give you a reference, it's right to say that the consideration of views and perception of the city were considered within the 2007 decision. That's by the inspector, paragraph 732 of that decision, who particularly stressed the issue of views from the A64, and that's why that's being focused. That's the first reference. The second reference is where this is discussed in Dr. Mealy's report, which is section 3 of that report, which I certainly don't ask you to turn up, but that's discussed and expands upon what you've just heard from Ms. Markham. And then the other point to pick up on is ST4, and the suggestion that ST4 would make a better alternative to ST27. As we understand it, and just looking at the documentation, I've been trying to find the hectarage. It's controlled by Persimmon, promoted for residential development. So question mark in terms of its deliverability, but also its size. It appears to be 7.5 hectares and therefore smaller by some margin than ST27, and on our evidence it wouldn't be enough anyway. So I don't think it's been put forward as a direct alternative by Historic England. It's just that would be a better location, I think, is the way it's been pointed out. But that's probably an obvious point, and you'll have discussed ST4 long ago, I think. Thank you, sirs.
Thank you. Before I open it up wide, Mr. Elvin, was there anything you wanted to say at this point?
Can I get Jane Healy-Brown just to comment briefly on the points that were being made about the green belt by third parties, please?
Thank you. So in our matter statement, we set out the appropriate references to the assessments that were undertaken. So I won't go through all of those in detail. But I draw your attention to Annex 3, which is document CYC 59E. And that demonstrates that the proposed green belt is appropriate, and it also considers the alternatives that have been explored, and that sets out the reasons why they are less appropriate than what has been proposed. So moving on to two of the particular points that I think have been raised, and particularly the points around Purpose 4 and Mr. Langler's points on that. In the assessment, it is recognised that Purpose 4 is relevant in this location and to the proposed allocation. And that does include the issues of compactness, as you referred to in your previous question, sir. The Council's view is recognising the need for development of the university and looking at what the options are. Recognising that that is an important part of the form of the heritage of York as a city. And that's where the proposed allocation is allowed for, but with the wording within the accompanying policies that set out the requirement for the separation by landscaping to provide that rural setting the developed area of the proposed university area back from the A64 to address the issues of compactness. And that is set out in 3 of the proposed modification policies. The specific one that relates to the proposed allocation of ST27, which is the proposed modification policy SS22, and that particularly refers to the buffer to the A64, including for heritage purposes, and the supporting text at paragraph 3.98a details those requirements and explanation behind that in more detail. And that policy then is consistent with the proposed modification policies ED1, which is the university as a whole, and ED3, which relates to this campus. In terms of a point Mrs. Hilton raised, which relates to alternative boundaries in this location, and suggesting consideration should be given to moving the green belt boundary closer to the built form and Lakeside Way rather than the road further to the south, which is Low Lane. This is included in the assessment of options in Annex 3, which is set out on page 685. And the reason Lakeside Lane was decided as less appropriate than Low Lane is recognising that this is an internal road within the university and therefore may not have the same degree of permanence that Low Lane would provide, and indeed notes that the alignment of Lakeside Way has actually changed over time as well, which reinforces the permanence point. And finally, in relation to the Greenbelt boundary and ST27 and the separation with the university and Heslington, that the proposed alignment, I believe, would provide that separation to continue and has Greenbelt that does separate those. Thank you.
Okay, I'll come to Ms Hilton first, and then I'm going to come to Mr Coursier, I think. Go on.
Thank you. Just a brief point. So if the green belt boundary couldn't be put on the internal road because the road may move, why couldn't it be put on the northern edge of the lake then, unless it's considered that the lake may move as well?
Ms Healy-Brown, can you deal with that quickly?
I think it's right. The lake would be a more permanent feature, so that could be another alternative that could be considered. Obviously, that sort of lake would provide openness as part of the Greenbelt setting as well. It's then a matter of how you would connect that through into the existing, to the other boundaries. So it would need looking at how it would all link up.
Mr Coursier, I'm going to come to you then.
I think, sorry sir, I think Councillor Water was halfway through his submission before the break and hadn't actually finished it, as I understand it.
I took it that Councillor Waters was going to raise a few matters and then save some up for later on, but I'm relaxed. If Councillor Waters, you want to go first, then
I was just going to defer to Mr Coursier because he'd been waiting longer, but it's entirely up to you, sir.
I'm happy going, sir. I seem very loud, am I, to everybody else?
You are, but it's not a problem.
I'll get away from the microphone. The Vice-Chancellor raised the issue of numbers of students. I know we discussed that on Thursday, but there are just a couple of very brief points to pick up on that. So the Vice-Chancellor referred to a demographic bulge for domestic students. And so I did actually refer to you to the 2020 based ONS projection for England. And so that does show a slight increase over the next few years. But by 2038, so the increase was only about 5%. Very, very small increase in that university entry cohort. So just in terms of international students, in terms of what has been happening in the recent past, you'll be fully aware that the main competitors, UK, for international students have all basically have closed their numbers. That's the USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And so that's the reason why UK has been so popular in the past few years. In terms of the EU students, and I think this is just another point, you'll again beware, because of Brexit, there's been last year, the rules actually changed. Up to then, EU students paid the rates for domestic students. That changed, I think, last year. But that again accounted for why there was a surge of EU students in the past few years, because they were trying to evade that increase. And so I found, in fact, over the weekend, I found an article in something called the University World News, which actually cites these facts. So just in with the space needs of the university, and I don't want to get into detail that you've heard today, but I think very importantly, so we refer this in our hearing statement. I'm really quite surprised that neither the university nor the council have actually drawn this to your attention. And so this is the university's own strategy, published strategy on their website, 2020-2030. And it's page 12. And under the heading, Transform the Whole Student Experience, there is the stated objective by 2030. And so I'll read it out word for word. We will have as many students studying at a distance as we have on campus. Hugely relevant, sir, to the space requirements of the university, but not alluded in any way in any of the evidence from either the university or the council. And so that would imply, if that is clearly one of these sort of an aspiration, it may not be achieved, I understand that. But it does imply a significant reduction of the amount of space required for the student numbers which the university is projecting. And indeed, the Vice-Chancellor did accept that remote learning would have a major part to play for international students, particularly from the poorer areas of the world, such as Africa and South Asia, which he saw as being the major growth areas in the future. And so that statement in itself is of absolutely essential importance when you're considering need. I can't overstate it. So in terms of remaining space needs, we say that these can be met without ST27, sir, by a more intensive use of the land and buildings within the existing two campuses. So we think that there is opportunity that has a variety of ways. So one is obviously better use of existing buildings, redevelopment of existing buildings, and so in some case use of existing car parks, and indeed possibly the development of some of the green space, particularly on Campus East. And so we recognise that, that may have amenity implications, but so that is better than developing a critical part of the green belt around York. And so just to give you one example, so if ST4 were to go ahead for housing development as planned, there's a large area of green space just below it on lower slopes of Kimberlow Hill, because obviously ST4 is on the top of Kimberlow Hill, and there are lower slopes which were kept green on the master plan because the whole intention of the master plan was to keep Kimberlow Hill undeveloped. And if ST4 would go ahead, that rather removes the purpose. And so that comes very clear. So when you look at Campus East from a distance, from the Long Lane Bridge, the vicinity of the Long Lane Bridge over the A64, which is probably the best long-distance view. So we say there's a potential also to develop alternative sites close to the university. So, like Historic England, we think SD4 has potential. And so we also think that ST36, the barrack site, has potential. Both sites are very close to Campus East. And there are obviously both sites are currently allocated for housing development with a total, I think, of 980 dwellings. But that is less than half the oversupply which EXCYC 76 shows at 2038, which is 2,516 dwellings, even take into account the allowance, the 10% allowance for non-completion. So there's a great oversupply of housing land in this plan, and I know we've referred to that previously. And so the further option, sir, is developing sites away from the main campus, because obviously ST4 and ST36 basically adjoin the existing campuses or are in very close proximity. And so including the vacant land and buildings within the city centre and elsewhere. And so we do accept that that may be a slightly less efficient way of the university using its resources, but we think that the inefficiency has been greatly exaggerated by the university. Most other universities, UK universities, have developed on the basis of their campuses and activities being spread over a wide area. And so we say it will be inevitable after 2038 that the university, if it is to continue to grow, will have to adopt such a strategy. And so what we think is this, if the university has just simply not pursued these realistic alternatives before they have opted to go for a greenfield expansion to the south, presumably because they control that land. And they haven't taken a realistic look at the alternatives or pursued other alternatives such as ST4 or ST36. And so, I'll give you another example. The retreat site, again, another large brownfield site adjacent to Campus West, has recently come up, and the council and the university did not secure that. And so just to make clear that the Secretary of State, if you read the Secretary of State's decision at paragraph 20, he was quite clear that the reason he granted planning permission was because he was persuaded there were not alternative sites available. And we say that that exercise has not been pursued rigorously by the university or indeed the council before opting to go forward with ST27. And so we say that that should have been necessary because of the harm to the Greenbelt, which we consider will occur and which indeed Historic England consider will occur. So can I just deal with, I'm sorry, it's out of order, slightly out of order, the need for business development, or I think it's now been termed collaboration space. So in terms of any justification for that given by the council, sir, that's of course, in the Employment Land Review, which dates to 2016, which is now some 6 years old. So we say that that can't possibly be justification for additional space, at least by the council, because it is so old. And so we would refer you to the planning practice guidance, the reference 12/014-130729, was when it says the evidence needs to inform what is in the plan and shape its development rather than being collected retrospectively. It should also be kept up to date. For example, when approaching submission, if key studies are already reliant on data that is a few years old, they should be updated to reflect the most recent information available, a few years old, so not 7 years old. So the university has referred to potential collaboration projects, but so there's no evidence in front of you that these could be that these need to be located on sites which form the existing within the existing campuses or the proposed campus. They could be located, sir, as successfully on sites away from the campus, on other employment land. And so that's because the linkage which is required is the intellectual business linkage, not the physical proximity. And so there are many, as I'm sure you're fully aware, there are many university science parks which are not physically part of a university campus. And so the track record of the University of York is very poor in terms of attracting this sort of business. And so can I refer you to the 2007 decision again, sir, and the inspector's report, which is EX/OTH/24. And particularly, sir, paragraphs 161 and 165. And what we do see from this inspector's report is basically the case which the university is making to you is a reprise of what they presented in 2006. And 161, sir, the university was claiming that they would create, as well as 2,000 direct jobs on Campus East, they would create some 2,500 jobs from Science City York type activities. And then in paragraph 165, where the inspector notes, and this is the case this is from the case made by the City of York, sir. It says, it is suggested by objectors that all the uses envisaged by the university are speculative, with the implication that the developments may never happen. In fact, there are already 2 identifiable uses, and the names aren't important, with nowhere to go because of shortage of space. As Dr. Henshaw explained on the cross-examination, there's also advanced discussion around Creative Technologies Centre involving some household names that cannot be disclosed because of sensitivity of the business and commercial confidentiality. In fact, over the past, I'm trying to work out, 15 years, there's been as far as I'm aware, none of these names have actually come onto Campus East, and the level of job creation has been very small from collaborative exercises. And so that's been recognised by the university in its previous submissions to you, particularly in their publication submissions, publication representations. And the reason given is that it says one of the main factors limiting the site's attractiveness has been its restricted parking. So as far as I'm aware, the same parking restrictions will apply to ST27, and indeed the space to be liberated on the existing undeveloped land on Campus East. So we say in total that we don't think there is evidence at the present moment to justify such harm being caused to the Greenbelt. Neither the university nor the council has justified the harm that will be caused to the Greenbelt by ST27. And so can I just go on to... Do you want me to go on to Greenbelt, sir? I can deal with Greenbelt.
Yeah, I'm happy for you to carry on.
Yes, sir. Right. I want to just to take a point I've taken previously. So clearly, ST27 is shown by figure 3.1 as being one of the sites of importance to the historic character and setting of York. And indeed, as I've said before, paragraph 3.5 says that technical work carried out by the council indicates that regardless of the extent to which the city may have to identify further land to meet its development requirements and needs, there are areas of land outside the existing built-up area that should be retained as open land due to their role in preserving the historic character and setting of York. And it refers that the areas of land considered to serve this purpose are illustrated in figure 3.1, and ST27 is within one of those areas of land. And so, in that light, it's difficult to see how this site could and should have been progressed as an expansion site for the university. So we support everything which Historic England has said to you, and I do contrast the way in which the council has treated Historic England's comments in relation to this site against the reliance they placed on Historic England's comments in relation to ST15. But can I just take you to because it has been referred to, CYC 59E. I think it's very important to go through this document in a little bit of detail. I'm sorry to do that.
If you bear with me just a moment, Mr. Courtier.
And it's page, it starts at A3679.
Sorry, page?
680, so A3680. 680. It's entitled South of the University of York, Campus East.
I have that, thanks.
So I had to read this document several times to understand exactly what he was doing, but as I understand it, I've sought to agree that with the council, is assessing the potential of a greenbelt boundary which runs along the lake sides, and that boundary is shown on page 679. And so then it looks at the land presumably to the south of that, beyond that boundary, which is land to the south, which would include ST27. And under the title compactness, I'm going to read quite a lot out, draw your attention to quite a lot of this, because unfortunately I think it not only goes to this site, but it goes to the heart of much else in this examination, how far you can rely on the final conclusion.
I wouldn't want you to
read
out the entire
I am
thing.
not going. I have no intention of reading it out in entirety, so I'll draw out to you the most important bits. Clearly, under compactness, it says the land should be kept permanently open as part of a wider view of a dense, compact city in an open or rural landscape. And then, the second sentence It recognised the importance of the A64 as an important approach for viewing and understanding the city, and the sensitivity of openness within this land should be considered from this approach. And then, so it takes up the point which I've just directed you to, which is the fact that this is recognised by figure 3.1, which actually draws from the Greenbelt Appraisal 2003. And then it says, this area of open countryside provides an impression of a historic city set within a rural setting, and it's important as the open countryside is visible from a prominent location and provides good views. And then further on, it says, maintaining open rural land in the foreground to the York Outer Ring Road allows an understanding of the compact cities within the original countryside context. The sense of the setting of the city within an open and rural landscape is gained both from the view and from the general sense of openness to the A64 in this location. And then, sir, under 1.2, 1.3, the land should be kept permanently open as part of maintaining the scale and identity of York and its districts, as well as maintaining a connection to open and historic setting. And so, very important, the second sentence makes the point that the closer the urban edge gets to the ring road in this location, the more valuable the land becomes in preserving the perception of scale and open historic setting, and this therefore increases in importance and needing to keep this land permanently open. Of course, here ST27 goes right up to the A64 and is its narrowest point between the university and the A64. So I can skip on to landscape and setting. So under 3.1, which is page 682, says the land should be kept permanently open to aid the understanding of the historic relationship of the city to its hinterland. And halfway down, sir, it says there's currently a fairly deep buffer of agricultural land below the southern boundary of the campus east, enhanced by the naturalistic lake. As more open land within the outer ring road is diminished through development pressures, it has increased the importance of the remaining openness in illustrating the connectivity of the wider landscape and hinterland. So again, this grows to the importance of this site. And then So then further down, it is still important to preserve the open context of land on both sides of the important open approach to be able to prevent any future possibility of coalescence and understand the historic settlement pattern of urban areas evenly distributed within their own open and independent settings, separate and distinct from the main urban area. And then under urban sprawl, 4.1 says land is connected to the open area and therefore relevant for sprawl. And so very importantly, on page 683, it says Low Lane defines the southern extent of the allocated area for developments as set out in the outline planning consent. However, this includes areas of open space and green space to the north of it, which forms part of the important landscape buffer between the campus and surrounding countryside to the south. This provides a transition into the rural area, with the lake having been signed. Furthermore, as Low Lane connects with Heslington to the west, this boundary would risk reducing the gap between Heslington and the University campus east. Land to the north of Low Lane is therefore an important part of this buffer and should be retained in the Greenbelt. So I think that comes to Heslington Parish's Council's point. And so under 4.3, the proposed boundary defines where the University campus east meets its rural setting. Should development be allowed to occur freely within the land to the south and southeast of the proposed boundary, it would eventually be contained by the outer ring road. However, given that this land is important to keep permanently open in line with purpose 4, allowing development to progress up to the road would represent unacceptable sprawl as it would result in the loss of compactness and the rural setting, which would be detrimental to the York Greenbelt. So the key word there is the word unacceptable. And so under encroachment, we see that, again, very similar points being made. I don't want to bore you by keep on reading out the same point being made all the time. But then we come to how the council has then come to the conclusion that after those findings, the site could be, the SD27 could be accepted. And so that then becomes under strategic permanence, which is page 685. So the first, I'm starting reading under consistency with local plan strategy. In considering the request of the university and their need for land close to the existing campuses, the new nursery facilities and the excellent transport links which exist in this location can be extended. So the logic of that, I cannot follow, sir. It's therefore considered there is potential here for a sustainable employment growth location which would focus development towards the urban area within the Greenbelt in order to contribute to the long-term permanence of the York Greenbelt. The site is a sustainable option when judged against the site selection criteria and employment land assessment. Well, we know the site selection criteria would immediately, if you apply it rigorously, would mean that this site is not brought forward because it's in figure 3.1. As to the employment land assessments, that took no account of Greenbelt considerations. And then so we see land to the south and west of the proposed boundary is not designated for nature conservation. And then we see, however, land to the south and west of the boundary is in part designated existing open space hybrid, no, that doesn't apply, in part local, entirely identified as being of primary importance to setting of the historic area. Heritage impact, then we have a reference then to the heritage impact appraisal of this land has identified some potential scope for development if compactness, city and rural setting could be reserved. In order to do this, it's important to protect the narrowest and most visually important areas for understanding the rural setting. It is therefore important that development would need to be stepped back from the A64 outer ring road. So again, that seems to conflicts with what has been said previously. And so this ST27 is at the narrowest and most visually important area for understanding rural setting. That's been accepted previously. There's no logic in this, sir. Then on that basis, it comes to the conclusion that the open land beyond the boundaries has potential for development in line with the local plan strategy. A huge jump in logic. And so if you look at the heritage impact assessment, I don't want to read that out at long length to you.
I'd be really grateful if Mr. Corsier wouldn't read things out and would just draw our attention to this. We have all got these documents, and reading it out doesn't help anybody, still less himself. Give us the references and he can draw your attention without reading vast tracts, which he's just been doing. It's not a good use of time.
Take us to the HIA, Mr. Corsier, and pick out the bits that...
Yes, sir. So I read that out, and I haven't done that at this previous session, sir, because these findings are of such great importance to you. So
and we have we've read them as well, Mr. Corsier, believe it or not, and you haven't read out all the critical bits either. So it's better, please, just to draw our attention to the paragraphs you want us to look at.
Well, sir, I will again take you again, sir. That's I'm looking, sir, at SD 102, which is the Annex. Sorry, I'm marked up the wrong side. So again, the same findings already made, sir, in this document as in the previous document.
Mr. Corsier, have you got the document reference for the HR?
I'm looking at SD 102, sir. And unfortunately, my version isn't paginated, so on SD 27. It's internal, I've got internal paginations for sites. Each site's numbered 1 from so forth, but it isn't, I can't take you to a particular page. And so it does find significant, sir, significant harm to both compactness and to landscape and setting, sir. But the importance, it is, and so it's page 10 on the internal page on the SD27, where it says, where it finds significant harm, but it says development here will inevitably result in loss of part of the rural setting of York between the new university campus and SC. Screening and landscaping may afford some protection to the rural view from the ring road. May. And the recommendation is move the eastern edge away from the ring road and buffer the site to push and screen the development from the ring road. Significant green infrastructure to mitigate effects will be required. And that's the sum of it, sir. So you can put in dense woodland planting on any site in the greenbelt and prevent views in once it's fully established. I fully accept that. But that is not normally an acceptable way of dealing with impacts of views, because as I think Historic England rightly makes the point, and we make the same point in our hearing statements, that such dense planting would appear as alien in the landscape, in the present landscape, as the development itself. It's not a way of making a development acceptable with all the harm which has been cited in the various documents. And so if you don't have dense planting, you go for a parkland type setting, then you will see the buildings. That's the nature of parkland landscaping. So there is an immense problem either way. And so I won't actually, I think the one point I'd also add, sir, is of course, when we looked at SD15, part of SD15 is to have a link road from the new junction to the university and going on to the park and ride. That would run right from, we don't actually know where the junction is, because when I reread the proposed modifications council presented to us, it's quite clear that they're not, well, and the current proposed modification is not, I thought they had agreed to move that junction to the location which LDP were preferring. I think they're keeping its present location. Whichever location it's going to be, there will need to be a link road from it. The junction itself would do great damage to the landscape south of Hessington. Then you would have a link road from there running to the university, which would go right through the middle of the buffer area, the green area between SD27 and the A64. including, I think, if I took the LDP's plan, it would go right through the middle of the lake, which is now being proposed. Again, this is two developments which the council are not putting together, but that would do even more, have an even more urbanising impact upon this area of land, and indeed the adjacent open land. So we say that there will be very serious damage to the primary purpose. There would be a loss of openness. Indeed, sir, if we were, just in a small point, if we would have floodlighting on the land adjacent to the A64 for playing fields, that would do even more damage, sir. Presumably the floodlighting is for a multi-use games area, the type which they have on Campus West. And you wouldn't normally floodlight grass pitches. That again would have a significant impact on openness. It would result in urban sprawl. It would lead to the loss of open countryside. And so because it would divert development away from urban sites, it would also have an impact on regeneration. So we say to you, ST27, as it's currently proposed, is unacceptable. It hasn't been justified. It's not justified, and it's not in terms of the MPPF, and would actually seriously damage the primary purpose of the York Greenbelt, and as such would be contrary to national policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cushman. I'm just wondering the best way to deal with this.
Can I kick off? And I'm sure Mr. Tucker may want to add to this.
Yes, carry on then.
Mr. Corsier, I'm afraid, hasn't read out all of the relevant sections of the Greenbelt study. The Greenbelt topic paper 1 addendum is part of the identification of boundaries. However, it does make it clear at pages 686 and 688, that's PDF pages 27 and 29, that there is, although the site is important for the setting of the city, it makes it clear, fourth bullet point, page 686, it's important that development would need to be stepped back. And you'll see there's a reference to having potential for development, and then that is picked up on page 688, and the need for a setback. That is precisely why SD22, which balances the needs of the university against the issue of the Green Belt in drawing the boundary, having regard to NPPF boundary setting policy, requires, as the first point, this is SS22, create an appropriate buffer between the development and the Green Belt, and to meet the requirements of ED1 and the landscape and heritage setting. So the detailed design will have to accommodate those, and it's set out particularly clearly in the text that's to be added at 3.9a. SD27 plays a critical part in the attractive setting of the city. The land to the west is particularly important for protecting the setting of Heslington, distinctive landscape quality. The expansion will bring development close to the A64, mitigate any impacts, the landscape buffer. So all those factors have been taken into account. And as Historic England has rightly acknowledged, it's not the role of Historic England, nor would it seek to do so, to balance the issues of need with the boundary setting. And this is one example where the City Council is satisfied on the evidence that's been provided that there is need to allocate further land, even given the scope for economies within the two existing campuses, as we explained this morning. So these factors have been considered. And to turn to earlier criticism Mr. Corsier made, well, he's going over ground we discussed last week, but the question of remote working and remote study and those other factors have already been taken into account. And indeed, they're the reason why we are sceptical at this stage of a safeguarded area. But we remain entirely satisfied on the data the university has provided that there is justification for the allocation itself. And that is not ruled out by TP1, CYC 59E, but the policy is designed to factor in those key requirements for a buffer and for heritage assessment and for preserving the existing setting. Hence the criteria that are set out in ED1. ST27 is not dealt with in isolation. And you will notice also, when you look at ED1, there's a requirement for a development brief, an up-to-date development brief when applications go in for any development on the university site, which looks at the position of both campuses and ST27 at the same time. So these are all matters that are well in mind by the City Council. Of course, there are those who don't agree with the judgments that have been reached, but those are the reasons why we have reached those judgments. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. It's a long time since I've cross-examined Mr. Corsier, and tempting as it would be to join this, I won't do so, and it's certainly not something I can do in terms of giving evidence, but there's some of the points that have been raised which are surprising in inverted commas. Can I wrap a couple of points together? In terms of your perception of the effectiveness of tree planting, the creation of a buffer and landscaping in order to maintain the setting of the historic city, that's something that's quintessentially best judged on site. It's best judged from the A64. I have no doubt that you, sirs, have driven up and down the A64 many times. You will have gone from the McDonald's services all the way up to the Hull Road, and you may have spotted the odd tree or two. I'm terribly sorry. I'm partly to blame on that because when is that
a comment on our culinary preferences?
I think it's Mr. Tucker's own predilections coming out there.
I could wax lyrically about the many hours I've spent tootling up and down the A64 being somebody who hails from Scarborough. But more relevantly, it's an area where the Highways Agency and its predecessors undertook an awful lot of roadworks some 20 years ago, in which they instructed certain council that became King's Council before you, sirs. Trees are not an odd thing to see on that stretch of road by any stretch of the imagination. So the proposition that tree planting in that location and landscaping would be out of character and damaging seems a surprising one, but don't take my word for it because I can't give evidence. That's a matter that you'll judge on site. Equally, I can't give evidence about whether you have floodlighting on grass pitches, despite the fact I've played on rugby pitches up and down this part of the world with floodlights in York, in this neck of the woods. I'm not sure whether Mr. Corsier has done or not, but you'll make of that what you will. More seriously, Mr. Corsier threw in an attack with regards to the evidence in terms of collaborative space and drew attention to the 2016 study and read PPG. What he didn't pick up is that's not our case. Maybe part of the council's evidence base, it's not part of my client's case. Our case is bang up to date. Their IIP, adopted this year, has known knowns, to use Mr. Nichols' evocative words to conjure up the spirit of Donald Rumsfeld. And those known knowns include projects which are real and for which the university is seeking to make provision in the next decade. So to suggest that there's no evidence of collaborative projects and that the evidence is out of date, with respect, that's not a proper attack in relation to the information we've put forward. Mr. Corsier also drew your attention to paragraph 20 of the Secretary of State's decision letter. This is the bit where I was itching to cross-examine him. Paragraph 20 of the decision letter, he said, gives you the support for the fact that it's down to us to demonstrate the absence of alternative sites. Well, firstly, if there were such sites not in the Greenbelt, not constrained, then we would have scoured over them, or no doubt somebody would have raised them before you, sirs, anyway in this plan. However, what Mr. Corsier didn't draw to your attention was that the no alternative sites in that paragraph supposedly is the base of the Secretary of State's decision, was in the context of the then test in respect of the release of Greenbelt land when you're demonstrating very special circumstances. It's not some high-level a priori test, because here we are setting Greenbelt boundaries. It's a different exercise with respect. Also with regard to site visits, there was a suggestion of the land south of ST4. Having had the pleasure of being in that neck of the woods, I know what the hill looks like and where the hill is. But sirs, can I invite you, when you do undertake, or when you accept my client's invitation to have a look at the campus east and west, you just note where Kimberlow Hill actually is, south of ST4. You'll see on the contours on the plans that we've produced already that it's a bit hilly south of ST4 in that little bit. That's no doubt something that will be self-evident. In terms of other points, your attention was drawn to a publication called University World News. It's not a publication that I subscribe to, but it's not also a publication that I think is before you. So I don't seek to address you in relation to that, save for urging a degree of caution when looking at comparative evidence bases. On the one hand, you have the views of the Vice-Chancellor of one of the most respected universities in the country. On the other hand, you have Mr. Corsair, who's read a magazine over the weekend, who takes issue with it. That's the sort of stuff that I put in a closing submission. But in relation to the university strategy, the 2020 to 2030 document, Mr. Corsair said, you can infer from page 12 that because it said that there would be as many off-campus online students as there would be online, that means a significant reduction in numbers on campus. Well, during the last half an hour of our lives, sir, I've read the entire document again. It doesn't say that. That, with respect, is confirmation bias.